And I will begin with something that all my students who have been with me know that I always begin my classes with, which is with the kind of paraphrasing of a writing by a German scholar, a German intellectual scholar named Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin was essentially an essayist who in 1939 fled Germany on his way to the United States, and on the frontier with Spain, trying to get in so he could make it back to this country. The frontier was closed and he committed suicide. Out there, never made it to the States, never made it to freedom. He has a wonderful and evoking story which is, in a sense, collected in a collection called Theses on the Philosophy of History. And he says that he had just seen a painting by Klee, and the name of the painting is the Angelus Novus, the New Angel. It is a ghastly painting. And he likes to think of this angel as the angel of history. And the angel of history stands on a promontory looking into the past. And in front of him, he sees the piling up of humanity's debris, all the oppression, all the terrible things that have happened in human history. The genocides, the violations, the wars, the famines, all of that keeps piling in front of him. And he wants to stop this. And his face looks into the past, and his back looks into the future. And he wants to stop and put an end to all these agonies of mankind. But a wind is blowing from paradise, and that wind has been caught in his wings and is propelling him inexorably into the future. That pile of debris, which is the accumulation of human injustice and inequality, is, Benjamin reminds us, what we called progress. Essentially, what he did there, and in other of his works, is to mount a ferocious critique of the Enlightenment project, of the idea that progress, as we understand it, which is essentially often only a kind of mechanical or technological progress, marks any dramatic change in the human condition. And he'd like us to look essentially at the interstices, at the spaces between history, places of resistance. And if I bring this, is because all of you, when you went to high school, or even when you were at UCLA, you all read about the great moments in the history of the West. And some of the periods that you most emphasized was the idea that the Renaissance was this period of great art, and we all know about, of course, Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. But essentially when you took classes in high school and so on, you always had told, well, the Renaissance, great moments in the history of mankind, the works of Michelangelo and Leonardo, the works of Dan Brown, the Sistine Chapels and things like that. What you seldom learned is that Renaissance, which is an example of rationality, is also shot through and through with mysteries and alchemy and astrology and Hermeticism. What you are not told, because we try to emphasize the positive, is that in a period running roughly from the late 15th century, 1480s or so, into the middle of the 17th century, roughly 1660s, and in backwater areas of the world like Salem, Massachusetts, into the 1690s, between 80,000 and 100,000 people, mostly women and mostly elderly women, were either burned at the stake or hanged from the necks, because the majority of people in Western society, that is to say, people who are contemporaries of Descartes and Baudin and Newton and all that, believe firmly, and it was indeed heretical not to believe so, that these people who have been accused of witchcraft were engaged in this kind of huge international conspiracies, that they flew to nocturnal gatherings in the back of demons, that they continuously make mischief, and that in fact they were a great threat not only to religion but to society as well. That they were worshippers, indeed that they have committed themselves to do the devil's work. How is this possible? How could most of Europe, not all of Europe, how could most of Europe engage in this orgy of killings, and people who are incredibly intellectually gifted and who are some among the greatest contributors to learning in this period could actually not only write about these things, but act against these witches? Essentially what this lecture would like to do, what I would like to do here is to, and as I said, it's only a very short kind of summary of what we have here, is essentially to try to explain how this happened, why it happened, why it ended. By the 1660s, it's petering away. And finally, and most importantly, because I know that that's what attracts many of you, how, if you wish, you can become a witch. I will give you all the steps you need to follow in order to do so. Let me begin by talking about the kind of context in which this takes place. Let me point out to you that the Middle Ages, which have been so long blamed as this dark age and so on, is a period in which, although there are from time to time people who are accused of witchcraft, there is no systematic belief in witches. And in fact, the church thinks of it as a kind of aberration. From time to time, someone will argue that he or she is in contact with the devil, or is a necromancer, someone who speaks or communicates with dead spirits. But the church will not, in any case, really believe in a theology of witchcraft. It is only from the late 13th century onwards, essentially with the work of Thomas Aquinas, and later on in the 14th century, and certainly in the 15th century, that people begin to talk about witches and begin the processes of defining what witchcraft is. Now, I would also like to point out to you that, of course, witchcraft is not necessarily autochthonous to Europe. It exists in all cultures. But what we might call witchcraft in Europe is not necessarily the same as similar practice, or should we say allied practices in places like China or pre-Columbian Mexico or other places in the world. After all, witches appear in the Bible. Saul goes to visit the witch at the cave of Endor, so that there are biblical references to the presence of witches. But the whole, should we say, ideology of witchcraft is really crafted from the late 15th century onwards, and it becomes a dominant discourse in Europe in this period. Why? Why did this happen then? What are the reasons for which people go crazy and begin to look everywhere, under the beds, underneath the carts, in the back seat of the carts, for witches who are going around creating trouble everywhere? Let me begin by pointing out to you certain, shall we say, facts about European cultural landscape in the late 15th century and later on in the middle of the 17th century. When we begin this story in, let's say, the 1480s or so, you have to think in terms of a big rectangle. And in this big rectangle, you have three things which are somewhat in, should we say, great disarray: magic, science, and religion. And most of religion in this period has elements of science and has elements of magic. And magic has elements of religion and has elements of science. And science has both elements of religion and of magic. What I'm trying to tell you is that it is essentially a very juggled kind of rectangle in which there are no clear boundaries between these three kinds of ways of thinking about the world. By the end of our period, By 1660s, 1670s, the boundaries between what science is, what religion is, and what magic is, which will be essentially relegated to the side and seen as a kind of a product of superstition and so on, will be very clearly defined. And it is precisely these processes of defining these three categories that is going to create immense anxieties. That process we may call secularization. It is the processes by which Europe becomes secularized. But it is a very painful and indeed a very difficult process. So please keep that in your mind, that when the witch craze sort of peters away, disappears without any significant, should we say, important watershed, is because these processes of defining mental categories has been on the works for almost 200 years and now comes to a full crystallization. Two, so what we are really positing here is the distinctions between secularization and religion. But I also want to point out to you that new religious forms that emerge in Europe in the 16th century, specifically in the 16th century, will also have a way of essentially defining magic and witchcraft in very different ways. There is a great book called Religion and the Decline of Magic by Keith Thomas, and he argues how essentially the acceptance of new religious forms in England in the 16th and 17th century will bring about essentially the end of magic, or will bring about a new way of seeing the magical. So please remember that. And finally, before we move on to something else, you have to also remember that there are always, throughout this period and to this very day, two levels of religion. That is to say that the religion of people at the bottom of society, of the majority of the population, is a religion which was and remained to this very day a religion very much, should we say, under a varnish of what we might call superstition or magic. And there is the other religion, which is all these lofty ethical systems at the very top. But that essentially there is always this kind of contradiction between a religion as formulated by the learned elites and the religion that is practiced by people at the bottom. So, what is the context? And in many respects, what are the causes that lead to this massacre, mostly of elderly women in Europe? And a massacre it is. In some parts of Europe, in Trier, in the area of Trier, in southern Germany, only a woman apiece are left in villages. All the women in the village are killed except for one. So this is really quite a remarkable phenomenon. Now I want to say something very short, very specifically about the topography of, or should we say the geography of witchcraft, because although it occurs throughout all of Europe, and in fact there are cases of witch persecution in Estonia and Latvia, although there women and men are equally, should we say, attacked, in Western Europe it is mostly prevalent in places like Scandinavia, Germany, France, England, and some parts of Italy. Spain and Italy miss the witch craze altogether. There is absolutely no persecution of witches, or at least no well-organized persecution of witches. The question is why? Well, probably because in Spain and Italy there were already an Inquisition and there were already ready targets like conversos and moriscos. They didn't need witches. They already have the people they wanted to burn at the stake. So essentially there is nothing to do. Please, let me say something else too. There is a dramatic quality to witchcraft trials and witchcraft confessions. That is to say that throughout Europe, they all confess to the same things. Whether they are in Protestant countries or in Catholic countries, or whether they are being interrogated by inquisitorial authorities, or whether they are being questioned by members of the government, they all confess to the same. There is a kind of pattern of activity which led many people in 16th and 17th century Europe to actually believe that this was true, that there is this kind of conspiracy, that witches flew. It was like a Shriners conventions. They gathered together in Las Vegas and, had these huge orgies and things like that, because they all confessed to that. And there is a very simple answer which I should give you right off the bat, which is, of course, the questions are all the same. That is to say that there is a pattern of questioning by inquisitors and members of those in power that essentially lead to the same kinds of answers. And we know that for a fact. One of the greatest historians who have ever honored the Department of History at UCLA is Carlo Ginzburg, a god of history. And Carlo, very early in his career, wrote a remarkable book entitled Il Benandanti, The Good Walkers. And in it, he discovered these inquisitorial records of an agrarian cult in the Friuli. And I will talk about them later on. And essentially what he found is that these people had some practices which were very peculiar, and I will describe them much later. And the Inquisition came in and saw these practices in the 16th century and said, what in the world is going on here? It must obviously be witchcraft. And they began to question these people who continuously argue and insist that they were not bad witches, that they were good witches, that they were engaged in saving the crops. But over a period of almost 80 years of questioning, continuous questioning and disciplining these people, all these people who have been so convinced that what they were doing was essentially good and rational, will all admit to what the inquisitors were asking them or were telling them they were. What I'm trying to tell you is that it is not surprising that there is essentially a kind of unity to the entire experience across Europe, because essentially the techniques of questionings and the techniques of punishment are one and the same everywhere, and we shall see why. So why all this anxiety? Why all this fear? And I will go through this very quickly because we are obviously not have that much time. One, at the very end of the 15th century, things began to change in Europe dramatically. Meaning by this, that by the end of the 15th century, the village community, and witchcraft is essentially, though not always, a rural phenomenon. It's something that happens in villages in the countryside. By the late 15th century, the villages, which have been the heart and the core of essentially European life, began to be transformed by social and economic change. What I mean by this is that villages in which there was some kind of idealized communitarian feeling in which everybody either worked together or died separately, begin to essentially to emerge into societies in which there is a kind of social distinctions and class distinctions within the village community. So people became very rich, they began to buy everybody else, they began to enclose the lands. They began to drive many peasants off the land and into cities, or become a kind of itinerant population moving around. If you read Thomas More, Utopia, the first part of the book is dedicated to the hordes of poor peasants walking from town to town and being whipped and being put into poor houses. So essentially what you have is a kind of economic dislocation which coincides with economic changes, with the creation of economies of scales, with the discovery of the New World, with global economies, and with the birth pangs of the birth of capitalism. And this has important social consequences, because essentially at the beginning of the 16th century, what you have is an incredible devaluing of poverty. Poverty has been one of the Christian virtues. Blessed are the poor, for to them belong the kingdom of heaven. Those who are rich, a camel will go first through the eye of the needle before a rich man enters the kingdom of heaven. But by the Middle Ages, and certainly by the end of the 15th century and by the 16th century, by the end of the 15th century and by the 16th century, to be a poor person, especially if you are an involuntary poor person, that is to say, you haven't chosen to be poor for the love of Jesus, You are poor because you are poor. You are going to be seen as someone who is clearly not deserving of help. And so the poor laws, which become very common throughout European society in the 16th century, the denial of charity, the attitude towards the poor becomes a very important phenomenon. May I point out to you that many people who are accused of witchcraft are also associated with begging. So that it is not uncommon for an old woman to come to the door of your house and to knock at the door of your house. And should I tell you about the dual prejudice against both poverty and age? I remember when I was a child that my mother told me always, don't go by that street where there are those two old ladies who live in the house because they have the evil eye. And they are in the window saying, little child, come here, let me talk to you. No way. And after all, what is more revealing of the representation of the witch of that of an elderly woman suffering from osteoporosis? Bent with a little, right? Because there is that incredible hatred of the age. In the 16th century, we burned them. In the 21st, we send them to Florida. So, first question is that there are these important social and economic transformations that essentially change the world and that lead to new attitudes towards certain social classes and new attitudes towards money and towards poverty. Two, the late 15th and early 16th century also sees the rise of far more centralized kingdoms. We might even call them proto-nations. Essentially what we are talking about here is that by the late 15th and early 16th century, we have political entities, certainly in England, certainly in the Kingdom of Castile, certainly in France, in which those in power command an authority which they had not commanded before. We have here an intrusive government that can not only tax you, but which can also conscript you as well. So that what Max Weber called the legalized monopoly of violence is now in the hands of these kings, these rulers. And what we have in the 16th century is the unholy alliance between religion and politics. That is to say that persecution, whether of Jews or witches or those suffering from leprosy, that is to say the rise of kinds of persecutory societies, is a way in which those in power exercise and demonstrate essentially their authority and legitimize their authority, because all these events are really great theaters of power. The burning of a witch is a very important event. Not only do you do so in a public fashion, but when you do it, you also do it in a very peculiar fashion, which is that you not only burn the person, but before you burn that person, you also want that person to be reintegrated into the body of the community. That is to say, not only do you have to suffer the fact that you're going to be burned, but you also have to admit in public that you are truly a worshipper of Satan and that you regret it terribly, and that you will essentially ask for forgiveness from God, your king, and your community. If you are not going to do that, if you do not agree to do that, very bad things will happen to you. Yes, we want you to essentially confess. We want you to essentially be reintegrated in these kinds of ceremonies of both inclusion and exclusion, so that the power of the state is a very important component in the unleashing of the witch craze, of the witch hunt. Far more important, it is essentially the split of Christianity into two branches. From 1521 onwards, Europe is at war. the Protestant Reformation is an important watershed in European history. Here you have a world, the world of Western Europe is a world of Christians. They're all Christians. Oh yes, there are those Christians in the East, but don't take them very seriously. Oh yes, they are Muslims and they are Jews and they are now Buddhists and Hindus and all that, but in Western Europe, everybody's a Christian. But in 1521, you have two kinds of Christians. And after Calvin, you have like 14 different kinds of Christians. So think about how full of anxiety this will be. There you are so secure that you have all knowledge of truth. And suddenly, your neighbor said, no, you are wrong. And we are right. And you're wrong and you're right. And everybody has a different kind of Christianity. But not only that, the Protestant Reformation, which is what we call Luther's great movement, forced the Catholic Church also to, in a sense, engage into a change of itself. It's called the Catholic Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. What I'm trying to tell you is that by the 16th century, both Protestants and Catholics alike have essentially created a very different kind of Christianity. And the kind of loose practice of religion, which is so peculiar to the Middle Ages, in which everything went more or less and nobody really cared, is no longer permissible. So certain practices which were accepted before will no longer be accepted after 1521 in the Protestant world and after 1560 in the Catholic world. I give you one particular example. This, by the way, was a movement of reform of the church which predated the Catholic Reformation and which we see essentially surfacing already in the late 15th century. And you shall see how this works out. So there's also, in many respects, something that adds to the great anxiety of the world and of the period is the fact that all paradigms, all scientific paradigms, the Ptolemaic system, the Aristotelian world, they are all being overthrown completely by the rise of a new science. Now, this will not affect the populace as a whole because they don't have any clue about Copernicus or Ptolemaios or anything like that, but it certainly creates anxieties at the levels of the elite. There are no certainties in the 16th century. Everything is being contested. Everything is essentially in flux. This is the kinds of things that lead to a kind of communal fear, a sense of dreadfulness, a sense of dread that somebody named Jean Delumeau, a great French historian, has defined as fear in the West. And he argues that in a world in which everybody is afraid of things going really wrong, then one of the things that governments do, and this ties in with the whole idea of the development of centralized systems of authority, is that if everything is going wrong and everybody is afraid and everybody is incredibly anxious about everything changing, what can be more, should we say, acceptable than to blame someone for everything that is going wrong? Don't we do that to this very day? Yes. Isn't everything that is going wrong in this country the fault of Osama bin Laden? Isn't Osama bin Laden, as we speak, hiding underneath that table, waiting to pounce on us? Which means that let's forget about all the things that are wrong, as long as you can have a very clear target upon which to center all your hatred and all your fears. And governments in the 16th century or in the 21st century use these fears to great advantage. Now, the question which you will probably ask me is, but why women? What about left-handed people? What about cross-eyed people? Why then and why not women? Well, because there is something else at work here. One, there is a surplus of women. There are more women. Oh yes, there's something that I forgot which is very important. That the division of Europe between Protestants and Catholics leads also to 100 years of war between Catholics and Protestants. These are what we call the wars of religions, and they will devastate most of Central Europe. It is no coincidence that in Protestant towns, the witches are Catholics, and in Catholic towns, the witches are Protestant. So this is one of the ways this works. But because of war and because of economic change and so on, there are far more women than there are men. And there are far more older women surviving than older men. And women, the families in the 16th century are nuclear families, meaning all the women live usually by themselves. They live by themselves on the edges, on the fringe of towns, and they practice, some of them do. They are midwives, some of them practice herbal medicine. They are engaged in activities which will come very much under the surveillance of the rising state and of the church. And they are certainly not wanted. Women are very vulnerable. They are alone. There is also, as I pointed out to you, all this kind of mistrust of the age in that society. I want to point out to you that parricide is quite common in early modern Europe, and it will remain common into the 18th century. Something is missing here. There are two ingredients that are missing, and we shall see them. One, of course, is Satan, is the devil. If you are a Christian, you are a believer in the devil. That is to say, is an integral part of your system of beliefs that you also accept the existence of the devil. When you are baptized in the Catholic Church, the first thing you do is that in the act of baptism is you exorcise the devil out of the baby by christening the baby and by putting salt, which the devils and the witches hate tremendously. Now, in other societies in which there are things that we call witchcraft, it's really not witchcraft, because witchcraft is associated directly with the presence of the devil and Satan. Now, the devil is a very shady figure. He appears in the Old Testament. We know that he's one of the most beautiful angels there was. He rose up in arms against the majesty of God in his pride, and he was thrown down into the pit. Isaiah tells us that. But the devil is also, in some way or another, part of a very strong Manichaean strain in Western civilization. Meaning by this, Manichaean, a world divided between the principles of good and evil. And the devil, who is not the equal of goodness or the equal of God, is nonetheless this shady figure who has powers and yet at the same time depends on God. An example of this is, of course, the book of Job. There is God and the devil having coffee at a coffee bean, and God is telling the devil, look at the world. You know, they love me there. They love me. And the devil says, yeah, they love you because you give them all these things. And God tells the devil, okay, go ahead and stick it to my friend Job and see how he reacts. And he goes and does all these awful things to Job, and of course, the poor fellow, his wife nags him, and his children die, he loses all his fortune, and the market goes down 500 points. He sticks with God. And then eventually, of course, God gives him or the wife or the children, you know. The market goes up the next day, things like that. But you realize what the situation is here, that the devil is a very strange figure. But the characteristics of the devil are really developed from Dante onwards. And we see it for the first time in hell, in Inferno, in the Divina Commedia, and you see the kind of representations of the devil until the very classical image by Dürer in 1525, in which the devil is presented as the quintessential Jew. That is to say that the figure of the devil is essentially a figure that has been used as an stereotypical representation of the Jew. And you could see how these things conflate in a world in which there are very few Jews left, which is the world of France, and or no Jews left in France or England, and certainly restricted to the east in Germany. You conflate the long-term hatred and discriminations of Jews with that of witches. So Satan plays a very significant role in this story. And the second one, of course, is misogyny. And I can go here for another half an hour telling you about the hatred of women, which is so inherent in Western civilization. But we're running out of time, and I really want to do. But you must realize that there is a trend that runs through Western civilization in the two great rivers that essentially contribute to the making of Western civilization. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, where women are, and I could talk about that in the question and answer period, are essentially placed in an inferior role, or in the Greek classical tradition, certainly in the Athenian tradition, where essentially women are considered to be below reason and having no role whatsoever in procreation except for being a receptacle. So there's these very strong misogynist traditions which come together in the late 15th century. So what happens in the 15th century? We can actually trace to the day the making of the witch craze. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII heard about all these rumors of strange things going on north of Italy, in the mountains between Italy and Germany. What has happened in the late 15th century is that the Middle Ages, which was a civilization of the cities and of the plains, was now encroaching into the civilization of the mountains. The mountains were places not only of liberty, but places that were barely Christianized. Places where, far more than in other places of Europe, certain ideas about the world and about magic and so on had survived untouched by Christianity. This is what Carlo Ginzburg discovers in his study of the Benandanti, which is a survival of agricultural cults, agrarian cults that dated back to a world before Christianity. So in 1484, the Pope commands inquisitors to go into the mountain areas and find out what in the world is going on there. Two inquisitors, two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Incitoris or Sprenger, go up to the mountains and they are shocked by what they find. And they come back and they write a report. And this report is called the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. And it is an extraordinary work. And it's divided into three parts. How do you recognize a witch? How can you detect who is a witch or not? 2, how to deal with the witch judiciously in terms of bringing them to trial and so on. And 3rd, how can you protect yourself from witchcraft? This work will become the manual that will be used by witch hunters in both Protestants and Christians and Catholic societies. And it is the most misogynist work that you could ever lay your hands on, and it's available. You could read it. It's you could buy it. It's published by Dover Press, and it's really remarkable. It's the true first psychoanalytical study of a pathology, and the pathology is that of this hatred of women. They begin with this unbelievable diatribe about why women are so weak and why they are so easily seduced by the devil and why they are not to be believing anything. And then they go to this extraordinary and very interesting for 2 months to be talking about all the things that women can do to males through maleficium. And nothing is more threatening to these inquisitors and in the book than the ability of women to make men impotent. Or even worse yet, by magic to steal your penis. Yes, it's true, Tamir.
That's great.
There is a famous case of this village where the witches have stolen all the penises of all the men and put it in a bird's nest. And the priest came along and found the bird's nest and then took the longest penis there and put it himself, and he was found out. I mean, are you going to take this seriously? But it's true. And people believe these things. So you could see what world we are talking about here. The malleus will become essentially the kind of instrument that will be used again and again to identify and to bring witches to trial, and to condemn them, and to burn them. The witches are all the enemies as well. The medical profession is essentially very concerned with the herbal practices of many of these old women or midwives. Midwives are a favorite target for witch persecutors. So you could see how many things essentially come into essentially together at this time. Now, I am delighted to answer questions rather than talk all the time. So what I'm going to do is end up with a few observations on how to become a witch. Now, please remember that all the things we know about this comes from hostile sources. Witches are not writing treatises about themselves. It's all people writing bad things about them. And this is a very important compendium maleficarum, or the kind of compendium of all the bad things, written by Francesco Maria Guasso in 1555. And he goes step by step on how do you become a witch. Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to sign a pact with the devil, or with one of the devil's representatives. The pact, we know it from Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, and from Faust by Goethe, and by hundreds and thousands of confessions that are in inquisitorial records, is always written in blood. It's written by your own blood, and there you enter into an agreement with the devil or one of his representatives, in which it could be for lifetime, for a number of years. Dr. Faustus was for 24 years, in which you swear to essentially give your soul to the devil, in return for which the devil will give you. In return for which the devil will give you whatever you ask. Power, pass organic chemistry, become get a job in the biggest law firm in LA, sex, revenge, which is always so delightful, all the kinds of things you might want, in return for which you also commit yourself to do as much mischief as you can, do all kinds of nasty things to other people, and then eventually your soul will be carried to hell by the devil. Tell me the truth. Wouldn't many of you sell your soul for certain things?
You probably already have.
Yes, right. Some of us already have. Yes, indeed. Indeed. Wouldn't you sell your soul for vol-au-vent? Yeah, we went to Paris. All this bunch of people went to Paris with me last summer, and it was just great. They behaved beautifully.
So what was great about it?
Oh, this castle which is lit with candles is really great. This pact is usually, as I say, written with your blood and placed at a crossroads, the corner of Westwood and Wilshire. Because at the crossroads is where the devils spend most of their times, loitering there. Which is why when you go to Europe, in all the places where you have 3 or 4 roads coming together, you always have a cross to keep the devils away. Now you have already signed your pact. So what is next? And I could give you all kinds of examples about the pact and so on, but we don't have time. Next, now that you have signed your pact, the devil will imprint you with his mark. Essentially, it will be in the form of a bat or a toad, and it will be under your eyelids, in your armpits, or in your genitalia. Essentially, what we're talking about here is a birthmark. And you could see how rough it is that you have some kind of peculiar birthmark in your butt, and then you find, hey, you are a witch. This devil's imprint, which could also be a third nipple, and there are many people who are born with a third nipple, and the third nipple is to feed your succubus or incubus, and a succubus or an incubus is a spirit that the devil gives you to satisfy you sexually. And in the Salem witch trials, there is a woman, Bridget Bishop, who is found to have a third nipple, which after close investigation for 4 or 5 hours disappear by miracle. But you know, it's not uncommon for people to be born with a third nipple, which is there to feed your succubus. There is a whole profession of people called the prickers, who go around with long needles, and they introduce a needle into the sign of the devil, and if it does not bleed, that's a real sign that you're really a witch. So you could already see, you're packed, you have a mark. I want to point out to you also that a mark is a kind of imprinting in your body of the sign of the devil. It has incredible important connotations, psychological ones. It is a form of a tattoo. In the early modern period, only slaves were tattooed in the forehead. I am the slave of such and such. So that we are talking about something which has all kinds of important psychological connotations as well. Then, of course, the third step is you abjure your faith. You renounce the faith of Jesus, of Christ. You essentially accept the devil as your master. This is followed by casting away rosaries, scapularies, all those signs of your religiosity. You throw them away, you cast them away, and this is followed by paying homage to the devil or to his representatives. That is to say, in ceremonies, in these gatherings, which are called the Sabbats, this gathering of witches around the figure of the devil, usually a representative of the devil dressed as a he-goat, and do I have to go into the sexual connotations of the he-goat, and so on. The witches dance and come in and genuflect in front of the devil, and then they pay homage to the devil in a form which is repeated again and again and again in all the trials of witches, the confessions. They pay homage to the devil by kissing his behind, while the devil, and I am quoting from an inquisitorial record, emit a filthy and foul air. After all, ass kissing has still very much practiced in the 21st century. Then you swear to gain followers for the devil. Then you go into a sacrilegious baptism. You get new godparents. You get new names, because of course you have to have a name. And then you give a token to the devil, because there is the magical belief that if you give something to someone, we still do that, you give a lock of your hair or a piece of your clothing and so on, you are essentially putting yourself into the power of someone else. And we still use many of these beliefs to this very day. Then there is a magic circle, the famous satanic circle. You are inscribed in the devil's book, and then you practice sacrifices, mostly the sacrifice of children, which is why midwives, in a world in which half of the children die within the ages of birth and 5 years, then you could see that the killing of children, which is a very favorite charge throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages and the early modern period, is one that will become associated with witches. Not only the killing of children, but turning children into pies and eating them. And where do they do all these things? They do all these things in these great nocturnal gatherings. They are little ones which take place before Sunday, local ones, and they are the huge international ones. And the biggest day for witches is not Halloween, which is invented by Macy's and Robinson Mays, but Walpurgisnacht, which is associated, of course, it's the day before May 1st. And it's an important day in European culture, dating back to Celtic culture and so on. So the 30th of April is the greatest day for the gathering of witches, and that is where all these things do take place. Was this real? No. My view as a historian is that all this is a constructed phenomenon. It's constructed by those on top to essentially articulate a series of anxieties, and as a result of that, between 80 and 100,000 people lost their life. In a world without technologies of killing as we have today, killing 80,000 or 100,000 people is quite a terrible achievement.